Hey, thanks for checking out Nuts and Bolts with Tone. Welcome to my channel. Today I have a 2016 Dodge Ram with a 3-liter Eco Diesel. Now I previously did a water pump video on this truck and now it's back. It's a fleet truck. They put a lot of miles on it. And now it's back. It's got a coolant leak on under the intake manifold. It just comes out down the bell housing in the back. You can't see anything, can't pinpoint it, but underneath this intake is a bunch of pipes and connections and turbo coolant hoses and things like that. So the first one I ever worked on was head gaskets, and it was because of a failed turbo coolant hose, and a shop didn't do it. They fixed something else, didn't catch that coolant leak, and it blew the head gasket. So anyways, we're gonna be removing the intake manifold on this one. I kind of started yesterday, so I'll walk you through a few of the steps that I took already, and then I'll set up a camera and let's go. So step one is going to be to take off the airbox, just 5/16 or 8 milli bolts coming back here, and then that connection there is a little difficult to get disconnected, but anyways, you got to get that disconnected. We still have to take that out, but you got to take out these charge air pipes right there. It's got a ring, and you got to open it up, and you got to lift at the top, and it pops off. Same thing here. The hardest part about this is getting this part disconnected, but anyways, you get those off, this pipe comes out. And same thing with this one. You got to get this one off and disconnect it down here. It's got a 7 milli hose clamp because it kind of goes up through. The reason we got to disconnect that is because of these lines right here. These are the high pressure fuel lines that connect the high pressure pump, which is there, to the rails. This one here is the one that we replaced prior when we did the water pump. And then you have this one here that feeds the passenger rail. So we got to get those off in order to do this job. So you got to take this cover off. It's got 4 10s. Disconnect your vacuum pump connection right there. This goes to the vacuum pump. Disconnect that so you have room. Once you do that, these hoses here have 2 little buttons that you push in like that, and they pull up real easy. This connection right here. So you got this guy here, and he sits on a stud right there like that. So you got a 10 milli, but don't disconnect that 10 milli yet. You got to disconnect these two, and what I use is this OMT tool fuel line disconnect. These are aluminum. They're like metal. They're not plastic like the other ones that I have. So, and they've got a rubber band on there, makes them spring loaded, which is nice. They're not going to wear out. So this blue one here is what you use. Now these connections are hard to disconnect sometimes with 2 hands. But this just shows you how well the tool works, as I only use one hand to slide the tool in and twist off the line. Now this side here, I didn't get the tool pushed in far enough. As you'll see, it does not come off the first try. So what you want to do is you want to take this tool, and as you push it in, you want to twist it. And then you want to twist the line as you pull, and boom. You got to take off the engine covers here, the little foam things. So what I recommend is that when you take these foam things off, that you put them on top of the charge air pipe. So this charge air pipe that comes around here, I laid the foam on top of it so I don't forget it. So I can't grab the charge air pipe and put it on without putting the foam on. Same thing on this side. So you want to make sure you do that. Then for this here, once we disconnect this end, you take that 10 milli nut off. You got a connection here for the return. That way we can move this around. Now be careful, because this is a return line and you can't disconnect this. So you got to disconnect it from all the injectors in order to get this out. So that's how you take that out. Next step is going to be unbolting all of the harness connections and disconnecting as much as the harness as we can. We're also going to be taking off all of these fuel tubes here. You'll have to replace all of these fuel tubes and this high pressure fuel line connection here. So we got the fuel tubes. So I'm gonna be working on that right now. And then we'll get back there. We gotta take off that boot off the turbo. Take the boot off back there. And we're gonna have to take off that air horn. Don't disconnect your coolant if you're doing this like I am, because I have to pressure test this coolant leak to find out where it's leaking from. I just got the M12 Milwaukee underhood light. I'm gonna get that set up right there. Got power and mode. So you're going to need a 19 and a 17. I like to use the Capri Tools angled wrenches. You have 30 degrees on one side, 60 on the other. Between the two sides and flipping it over, you should cover just about every angle that you will encounter. I took the EGR tube out. It's 2/8 on one side, 2/10 on the other. And then it slides out of the intake. I'm going to pull that out. I'm going to put a rag in that hole, and I'm going to take an air nozzle and I'm going to blow everything off before I disconnect anything. Just getting some of these fuel tubes out of the way so we can get to the connectors and really get down and dirty with this. When I'm taking something apart and there are studded bolts or things like that, I will a lot of times make a reference mark. And so I mark this clamp here, or the clasp from the fuel line. I mark the studded bolt, and I also mark the hole on top of the EGR throttle plate there. So that way later, when I go to put it together, I know that those three pink things line up because that studded bolt needs to be there for the low pressure fuel system. Just a little bit of disconnecting, trying to gain access. The bracket that goes over the passenger front of the valve cover, there's a 10 down there you got to get off, and the airbox is in the way, plus the wiring harness is clipped to the airbox, and we need to disconnect the wiring harness to get it out of there to make things easier. So this little vacuum connection that sits on the front of the passenger head, to get this off, you're supposed to be able to push these two tabs in on the outside, but mine would not release. So what I ended up doing was coming and disconnecting all the other parts of it, spinning the line, and then sticking a pick in there and using actually two picks to depress the tabs to slide it off. So from here, basically the easiest way to describe this is what I do is I disconnect the harnesses right there from the PCM. I unclip them all and I start lifting the harness up, and I disconnect everything I need to disconnect until I can take this harness and go from the passenger side and lay it all the way over on the driver's side so it is 100% completely off of the engine and out of the way. So there's tons of connectors. There's connectors on the fuel rails. There's connectors at the back of the intake manifold. So once you get all of that disconnected and move that harness over, we can finish getting all the rest of the fuel lines off. So these snap-on Torx ball hex keys or ball Torx keys is what I use for the fuel rail bolts, and it's a T40. So here's what it looks like right there. There's the ball on the Torx. So you just need to keep pressure to keep it in properly so it doesn't strip it out. Getting the EGR throttle plate out is a little bit of a pain in the butt. You've got 4 bolts, a bracket on the driver's side, and then you've got to wiggle the throttle plate just right while disconnecting the connector to be able to slip the throttle body out from in front of the intake. And it has to come off first to get the intake off. And here I am disconnecting the rest of the connectors to flip this whole harness out of the way. So the next step, we got to get that little air horn off the top of the turbo. And the procedure actually calls for using a 5mm long ball hex socket, and it gives a snap-on part number. This is my carbine tools. This is what I'm going to use, and we have 2 bolts. Before you could take the rear bolt of the air horn out, you got to get the air intake tube the rest of the way out. And then there's one back there that's hidden, and then the air horn comes out, 2 bolts. So here, if you don't have individual caps to cap off the injector lines, just put a rag over the top of them just to keep anything from going into the fuel system. And here, before I take this intake off, I'm plugging all of the holes, the open holes, the intake, the PCV, all that stuff, and I'm going to take an air nozzle and just blow away all the dirt so it doesn't go into the cylinder heads. So here we've just taken out all the 8 milli bolts all around the perimeter. There's only 2 that are a little tricky. One is back underneath the turbo actuator, and the other one is right at the front, on the front left corner, on the passenger front corner. So here I'm going to pull the intake out. You just got a little wiggle it to get it out. Don't break your swirl valve on the bottom, and be careful for the harness. And now that we have the intake out of the way, let's pump up the cooling system and see if we can find this leak. Should be pretty obvious because it was pouring out from before. And oh yeah, right there at the bottom of the screen, pouring out of that rubber hose. Look at how swollen that rubber hose is. That is a turbo coolant supply hose. And it has a little rubber section of hose that looks like it's blown out, and it's puking on the inside. So here is the turbo coolant hose right here. There's the rubber section in the center right there. And here's the part number for that turbo coolant hose. So here's all the parts you need to do this job. All the fuel lines, gaskets, everything that we need. This is the water bypass. This goes in the top of the water pump, and it's a little plastic little housing. When I did this water pump, we couldn't get the seals. I had to reuse it. The next water pump I did, this broke. So we're replacing this now. And here's what that bypass looks like. 2 bolts on one side, and the other side slides into a hole. The fuel tubes for the injectors, you'll need 2 of these, and here's the part number. Right there. 1 goes on each side. And then you'll need 4 of this one right here. Now this is what you need to do it right. I mean, you could try to reuse the fuel lines, but if you have a fuel leak and have to take it all back apart, that would really suck. You're going to need 3 other tubes. You're going to need that one. You're going to need this guy right here. And you're also going to need this one. So 2 of these are fuel supply tubes from the high pressure pump to the rails. And the other one is a line that goes from rail to rail that wraps around the back. And here's the part number for the intake gaskets that you'll need. Now to get this old line off right here, what I'm going to have to do is unbolt this banjo. And I'm going to have to pull the hard line out and try to cut the old click lock clamps off. Then I'm going to slide my hose on. I've already marked my hose. So the hose came marked like this, and so I made additional marks like that. So I need to make sure that these paint marks line up with those clamps exactly perfect. Well, let's see how easy it cuts out. I'm just going to cut the rubber hose in the middle and get rid of the front section. Just applying a little bit of pressure. And like that, it's out. Wow, look at that. This is a really common leak on this truck. On this engine, I should say, not the truck. So you can see all the coolant is pushing out of that as I'm replacing the pieces in the front. So we can pressure test this when we're all done. So getting the hose in place, and these are the pliers that I use. They're by AST. They are swiveling click lock clamps. And the banjo for this coolant hose to the head is 26 foot-pounds. Get your intake cleaned up, get your intake surface cleaned up, put new gaskets in, and it's 108 inch-pounds to torque the intake down. Putting the intake in was a little trickier than taking it out. Just this swirl valve, you got to fit it between the head and all that. But make sure that it sits flush before you start putting your bolts in. So I just use a cordless ratchet to zap the bolts down, get them snug, and then I come back with a torque wrench and I torque them to the proper spec. So next up, we got to put the throttle body and the little front spacer on here. This is really difficult getting the throttle body in here with the connector. I had a really hard time getting it out, and I'm going to have a really hard time getting it in. And then we got to put the fuel rails in and do the harness. Then we have fuel lines. To get the EGR throttle plate in and get the connector on, you have to tilt the throttle body down at an angle, push your connector on, get it completely connected, then you can move it around, put it in place. Then you want to put your bracket on the driver's side. Do not clip your harness to the bracket before you have all the bolts in there. Snug those bolts down and then clip your harness into the bracket. And the rails are not compatible for each side, so if you put one rail on the wrong side, the bolts won't line up. So that's one way to not get them mixed up. The passenger rail has a connector at the back of the rail. You're going to put the first rail on. That's going to be the one that connects from rail to rail around the back. Then we're going to loosely lay the harness over the engine. Do not connect any connectors. Don't fasten it to any fasteners. Just lay it across, kind of how it goes. Then you're going to lay in the rail that goes on the passenger side. Now, when I put this rail in, I didn't put it on right. It actually goes over part of the harness. So I'll show you me fixing that. So don't fasten that 10 until you have it in the right spot. And then we're going to move on to the driver's side rail. Now this is one where I marked it, and so I knew which way it goes. Now I'm just trying to figure out which way it goes between the hoses. So it goes between the radiator hose and the bypass hose that goes up to the bottle. And then down to the injection pump. And here's where I realized that the line has to go up and over the harness like that. So I just had to undo that 10 and flip it around. That's why we don't connect any connectors or anything until we have it all in place. From here, you're going to lay out your different injector tubes and go ahead and get those connected. And you're just going to loosely connect these. Do not tighten any of these lines down yet. So the torque procedure for this is very confusing, and they made it all kinds of stupid. So it works like this. Here's your fuel supply tubes, and you have one at the back that wraps around from rail to rail. You have one on the left side and one on the right side. One connection is at the rail, the other one is at the pump. Then you have the injectors. It's real simple. Works like this. Your connections at the pump and the injectors are 96 inch-pounds and 75 degrees. At the rail, 44 inch-pounds and 75 degrees. That goes for all the connections on all these supply tubes. Thanks for watching the video. You should feel pretty confident going in and tackling this eco-diesel job. I have a few videos. I have a video on the head gasket, the timing, and also the water pump repair. So I'm trying to keep them coming on the eco-diesels. I know there's a lot of eco-diesel owners out there, and there's just not very much eco-diesel content. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell. You get notified of all my future content, which you definitely don't want to miss. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.